So let me welcome you all to Reefs at Risk webinar series. Thanks for joining us. We are going to be talking about Reefs at Risk Revisited today. And, slide problem. Here with us. Hopefully it's working for everybody except me, so I am going to work off it and just work off another computer. Okay, so thanks again for joining us, and today we are talking about Reefs at Risk Revisited. I wanted to tell you a couple of logistics about how things are going, and then tell you a bit about Mark Spalding, our guest speaker today, and a bit about what he's going to talk about, and then Mark is going to talk, and we will take questions at the end. So to get started, I wanted to remind everyone that if you do have a question, please put it in chat to Elizabeth Schrock, and we will be sorting and editing and getting end. And also, if you raise your hand, we will know which order it's in so we can answer those at the end as well. And a reminder that this will be recorded. The webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the link to everyone and send it far and wide if you know anyone who missed it who wanted to check it out. So again, I can't see my slides, I'm sorry, but this talk is Reefs at Risk Revisited, and it is going to be given by our own Mark Spalding. Mark is our senior marine scientist with the Global Marine Team here at the Nature Conservancy, and a very long and career and background on coral reefs. He's done everything from actual field work on fish communities, and also looked at bleaching impacts in the Indian Ocean, and he's authored many papers on and books in the coral reefs. So the main things he focuses on is looking at broad-scale threats in the environment, and collaboration with the World Resources Institute, or WI, who is also the lead institution on these Reefs at Risk visited and Reefs at Risk work on corals, have led to some really amazing discoveries and have really pushed the entire field along. So it's been a very fruitful collaboration with WRI and TNC, thanks largely, if not solely, to Mark. And just so you know that he's not just a coral guy. He's worked on marine protected areas, mangroves, and the quantification of ecosystem services as well. So he's quite prolific. I'm sure many of you know him, and he's a wild guy as well. So today's topic, again, is Reefs at Risk Revisited. It's the latest publication in a series of Reefs at Risk, and this one has a global analysis, which is about 13 years on since the original. The results, which many of you have maybe seen in the press, it's been a lot of attention, are a bit, they're dire, rather. You know, they're not what we were hoping for. It shows that even though, despite our years of effort and investment, reefs are even considerably more threatened, and even more top of the existing anthropogenic threats with the addition of climate change. So, is that a question? Okay, and so it sounds like somebody's not on mute. So if you could mute us, we're hearing a lot of background noise. Thanks. So I'm going to take us through the Reefs at Risk Revisited model and the results, but also get the documents associated with it and the set of recommendations that is submitted at the end of Reefs at Risk Revisited. So are definitely a threat, are threatened. We know, those of us who work on them, what bad shape they're in, but there's a lot of bright spots. And room for action. So with that, I am going to also point you to a few things. We have our links up today on reefresilience.org on events. And again, thanks everyone and our funders for making this possible. And turn it over to Mark. And for a reminder for those of you who've just gotten on the call, this is being recorded. And if you have questions, please send them in chat to Elizabeth Schrack. Thanks much. Take it away, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. I'm just going to quickly ask Kate or Liz, can you all hear me? Am I?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Good. Right. Okay. I wanted to talk for half an hour and find everyone was asleep. So thanks very much. You've probably all heard about Reefs at Risk, Revisited. In fact, I've had a look at who's listening in on the call, and it's fantastic to have such a sort of group to talk to share some of this stuff with. I'm going to give you a slightly altered version of the presentation that I gave at the Royal Society in London on the day we launched Reefs at Risk. And you briefed the background behind why we did it. I spent quite a bit of time showing you how we did it, and also quite a lot of time talking about the findings. So we'll dwell also on some of the recommendations that come out of the report. As Caden said, this is not the first time we've done Reefs at Risk. It's revisited. We first did a study in '98, and between '98 and this one, there have also been two major regional studies covering Southeast Asia and the Caribbean. Let me just hold of things here. So I don't need to tell this audience what a coral reef is, obviously, but just to help us, Reefs at Risk looks at coral reefs. We're not talking about the cold ones or the deep ones, and really I don't see, for me they're a very distinct habitat type, and I think it's confusing to try and sort of morph two together too much. It's a reminder to me really to tell you all that actually part of this process, an early stage in this process, was that we've actually developed a new map of coral reefs, which is really exciting and brilliant stuff. It's come from multiple sources, rather like the World Atlas of Coral Reefs and the data behind that. But a lot of it's come from Sir Andre Fouet's work with the Millennium Corals. It's fantastic, a much higher resolution global coral reef map, and that's an important output from this project. Again, I don't need to tell this audience much about why reefs are important. They're tremendously important as a source of food, livelihoods, security in over 100 countries around the world. Hundreds of millions of people are highly dependent on coral reefs, not just for food, of course. Tourism is this booming industry which is shoring up many economies around the world. Reefs often provide this fantastic rocky rampart around the most vulnerable coasts of the world. Without the reefs, there would be nothing between the storms and hurricanes of the tropics and the vulnerable coastal communities. Reefs in fact build many of the coastal landforms that we're familiar with, the coral atolls, beaches, and so on. And of course, as we look into any of these megadiversity systems, such as coral reefs, we see some of the extraordinary diversifications that lead to complex secondary metabolites in animals and plants, which have fantastic potential value as products, and we're only just beginning to scratch the surface. You certainly know all this, but it is worth reminding all our audience just how important reefs are for people. Reefs have been under pressure for a long time, for decades. Unsustainable comes in lots of guises. Top left there is a haul of illegally caught sharks in the Chagos archipelago. But we're death and cuts for many of the world's coral reefs, as just too many people are trying to take too many fish off the reefs. Missing the catches and and the individual fish being caught down to really what you might call tiddlers. The picture on the bottom left there, vicious. These aren't just affecting the fish themselves, but as we've known now, many of us for years, as you start to knock out really entire trophic groups from a complex ecosystem like this, you leave the entire ecosystem vulnerable. So the bottom right picture there shows just what happens when you've got no grazers left on a reef system. Algae really starts to take over, and you don't have a reef anymore. And fishing has other guises as well. Obviously, blast fishing is a huge problem. Trampling as hundreds of fishers walk across the fragile reef flats. And ghost fishing as nets and traps get lost or abandoned and continue to catch turtles in this picture for months or years, decades even. So it's a huge problem, but it doesn't end there, of course. Many of our activities have direct impacts offshore. Chopping forests, agriculture on steep slopes and so on is adding huge sediment burdens to rivers which make it out to the sea. Add to that agrochemicals, untreated sewage, the conversion of mangrove forests and other coastal lowlands are all having a huge burden on coral reefs. This much, of course, we've known for years. Climate change, coral reef, the canaries in the coal mine, as everyone says, is having its impact too, and we've seen bleaching events, massive bleaching events, going back, really, but of course 1998 was a bit of a wake-up call with the El Nino and global bleaching event, really, which we've known for years. But it's actually quite hard for us to tell the story in a convincing manner to many people. And part of our problem is while there's thousands of reef scientists around the world and there's lots of monitoring going on, we don't really have a tight handle on the global picture. The monitoring that's going on is focused close to centers of human population. We're not capturing vast areas of reefs in our studies. And kind of me back to when I was really just getting started in all of this work in '93. I went to a meeting organized by Bob Ginsberg in Miami. We had, I think it was about 100, 150 of us from around the world to come and tell our stories about what was happening to the world's coral reefs. It's extraordinary because one by one people were standing up from Polynesia and Melanesia, from the Caribbean and Brazil, and really telling the same rather gloomy picture that the reefs in their patch weren't doing as well as they had been, and things seemed to be getting worse faster. But the problem even then, even when you had people from 100 different places standing up and talking, was that it was still hard to take a numerical case. Scientists are notoriously wary of looking beyond quadrats and telling a big picture. What we tried to do, Reefs at Risk, was to say, well, can we use proxies? So we've got this here on the left, a slide, which is a kind of list of some of the major threats to coral reefs. Of course, we know place-by-place basis where these threats are being carried out, but we do have global data sets for other things, and use some of those data sets to point towards the likelihood of these impacts taking place on coral reefs. And that's precisely the idea behind Reefs at Risk. What we wanted to do was to build a set of proxy measures, what was likely happening, what were threats facing reefs worldwide, every single reef. We first produced this report in 1998, and it had a really powerful impact. It was extraordinary, actually. We were covered by really the world's press. I mean, name of the country, and there was an article in the major newspapers about it. There was a debate in the Houses of Parliament in the UK where this report was waved about, and really the Prime Minister was asked, what are we doing about this? It's been cited ever since, hundreds of academic citations. It's also used as a sort of fairly important prop in an IMAX movie as part of the plot of the IMAX movie. It worked across a whole range of audiences, which was impressive. And released this product this year. So first I want to tell you kind of how it works, how we built the models up, and then I'm going to take you into the results. So we summarize the threats to coral reefs in the direct threats into four major categories. The first, and perhaps the best to give an illustration of I think, how thoroughly we've done the job, is to look at the watershed-based threats. This is the land-based sources, if you like. This is first off, then, we took a map of the world and a set of watersheds. These are the lines. I think I've got a pointer if I'm clever. I don't know how to do it. Yeah, hang on. Can you see an arrow? I think you can. So these lines, this is Borneo in Southeast Asia. These lines demarcate the boundaries between watersheds. So each of the areas demarcated by a line here is a river system flowing out to the sea. Well, with help, we produced a map of 300,000 watersheds around the world. Okay. Onto that layer, we then the type, because that has an effect on erosion and erodibility of the land. We then added rainfall. I think this is the rainfall. Getting confused myself. We added rainfall to look at the periods of peak rainfall, which is going to affect how much erosion takes place, because erosion tends to take place at the periods of highest rainfall. We then added land cover. Certain systems, agricultural systems in P are going to be eroding faster than others. So those combined, we can get a sense of how much sediment is coming off the land, and also with the addition of agriculture, how much agri-chemicals are getting into these riverine systems. A little bit further than that, because we then were able to reset the clock, as it were, whenever these riverine systems got stopped by dams, because that tends to allow sediments to settle out and for some of the nutrients to be removed. And we also built in a small filter, a broad filter, where we had mangroves, which are the dark colours you can see on the map, which have some role in reducing the amounts of sediments getting out to the coastline. Well, then you can start to say, well, how much big is the threat? The relative erosion potential was what we were talking about, getting into the coastal waters. And from that, we built plume models, which show just how these sediments would be spreading out from these different river mouths. So you can map now along the coast. You've got areas of high threat in red and medium threat in orange. And we overlay that. We overlay that then onto the coral reef map, and any areas that fall within these red or orange areas are considered to be threatened. Watershed-based threats. We go more quickly through the others. With marine pollution was another of our threats, and here we've got a map showing sorry, it's put in the middle there, showing the shipping lanes, the movements of ships. The circles are the major ports, and the size of the circle shows the size of the volume of traffic going in and out of those ports, and the red circles are the cruise ship ports. All of those are major sources of marine pollution, including pollution, sewage being dumped off ships, solid waste, and so on. And also in this layer we added oil and gas installations, although there aren't any in this map. Element was another really important layer here to try and get a measure of what's going on in terms of the building, the release of sewage into coastal waters, and so on. We use population, both cities and towns, population density, both rates of population, because that's going to affect how rapidly things are changing in that environment. We added in hotels and the tourism industry, a measure of just how big the threat of coastal development would be in different places. And again, you can just see a halo around the land areas there, show how those land surfaces got converted into a coastal threat, which we then drop over the coral reefs. And finally, fishing or unsustainable fishing. To get at this layer, we used, again, coastal population densities, and we made adjustments to allow for markets, because markets are going to drive fishing even in remote settlements if there's a nearby market, and also the presence of sort of mega populations where there's a population of over 500,000 people. That's going to drive pretty much ubiquitous overfishing over wide areas. Again, there were some modifying factors in this layer, so where we had effective protected areas, they reduced that threat to some degree. So that taking you very quickly through the four what we call direct threats to coral reefs. Watershed-based threats, marine pollution, development, and overfishing. Of course, in the last couple of further threat has arisen in the form of coral bleaching. That's not a future threat, that's already a threat that has affected many reefs, and we wanted to build that in as well. And we did that combined approach of direct observations of bleaching events, which we took from Reef-based, a model of global sea temperature data modified by NOAA to give us degree heating weeks, where we had any incidents of likely bleaching events that was built in. Those 5 layers, we wrote a map of the threats to the world's coral reefs. And what we found was that 61% of the world's reefs were threatened just by those direct impacts that I talked about. But when we build coral bleaching into this model, and recent means over the past 10 years, we found that 75% of coral reefs are threatened by human activities. Let me take you through the results in a little more detail now. Breakdown by threat type. You see from this graphic here that fishing and destructive fishing are the biggest single threat to the world's coral reefs. I'll just step back quickly because I didn't mention, but in addition to the overfishing, which I talked about, that overfishing, that model's threat included also a map of destructive fishing impacts worldwide, largely focused in Southeast Asia. Nearly 60% of the world's reefs threatened by unsustainable fishing practices. Direct threats are much lower. Marine-based pollution and damage was the lowest of all, perhaps not surprisingly. That's probably none of us would rate that as high as the others. Coastal development and watershed-based pollution are also in the 20 to 30% range of the world's coral reefs. And you can see what happened when we moved this to the indicated threat. When we put all of these threats on top of one another, we bump up to 61%, as I mentioned, and when we add the impact of bleaching, it rises up to 75% of the world's reefs. What I'm going to do now is take you on a kind of region by region, a rapid sort of tour of the world to talk about these threats in a little more detail, following the structure of the report pretty much. If you've got it, this will all be familiar with you, and you can download it anytime you want. It's all online. So starting with the Middle East, as a region, this comes sort of high, I suppose, on the threat list, but it's highly variable between the two sort of major seas of the region, with higher threat in the Persian Gulf. A lot linked, obviously, to oil gas. The sea still coming out looking relatively healthy, and in fact, these are some of the last large tracts of continental fringing reefs that are coming out at low threat anywhere in the world outside of Australia. Shipping is an important threat in this region compared to other regions, at least, and it thus far has been badly hit by bleaching. To the rest of the Indian Ocean, or the wider Indian Ocean, this is a region that's over 5% of the reefs in this region are threatened. core models. And you can start a pattern on this map, I think, which is fairly widely true, which is that the remote oceanic reefs, such as Chagos, the Maldives, Shells, and so those other Indian Ocean islands, tend to be off. The threats lower than the continental margins, where populations are higher, where the threat of terrestrial runoff is also much higher. They stand out rather shockingly as the most threatened region in the world. 95% of its are at risk from these direct threats. Really much everywhere, and the overfishing is the far and away the biggest contributor to this threat. But development and watershed-based pollution are also high. It's a shocking picture. Huge contrast as we move to Australia. We move to the region where our models show threats to be well lower. Only about 15% of the reefs in this region are threatened by the direct human impacts. Now, this map has caused a little controversy. Certainly some people in Australia feel that we've possibly underestimated the threat here. But I think the map shows what's going on fairly well, even if there is some underestimation. It shows the very tight linkage between the coastline and the threats. And the watershed-based pollution is a problem in the coastal reefs of the Great Barrier Reef. But huge tracts of the Great Barrier Reef are far offshore. And the Great Barrier Reef, by the way, is about 11% of all the world's coral reefs in one system. And hence the bar is set quite high by many scientists to look at the Barrier Reef. There are human impacts on those offshore reefs. There's a strong signal that overfishing has had some effect on the reefs. Certainly the fishing is permitted, but those effects are really very low compared to most of the other world's reefs, and it may be that our model simply is better tuned to the rest of the world, and you will set a higher bar, a higher standard for Australia. Moving into the Pacific, this is where about 50% of the reefs are threatened by human impacts. I talked about it rises to over 60% when we add in the coral bleaching. And here are really around the high islands, the big islands of Melanesia, Solomons, Vanuatu, parts of Papua New Guinea, so the high islands of Hawaii are coming out as more threatened than many of the more remote atoll nations. Where the threat has increased quite considerably since our 1998 study as well. And finally to the Caribbean, where the reefs, but this map obviously is the Caribbean, where the threat again is very high. Over 75% of reefs are affected by direct human impacts, and overfishing is very spread across this region. It's my digression here and talk about the difference between threat and actual condition, because I think it's worth it. I think a lot of us have an impression that the Caribbean is really struggling at the moment, that many reefs are really in poor shape, perhaps more so than Southeast Asia, and I think that's probably true. I think what's going on here is that our models, they are models, as what it says on the tin. What you get is an sense of the threat facing systems, but doesn't actually directly tell you what condition they're in. In the Caribbean, these reefs have been weakened by human impacts and then been hit by diseases, coral diseases, the Dima die-off, and on, and have really, condition of these reefs has gone down pretty fast. And when we think back to the image you just saw, the map of Southeast Asia, where the coral reefs are apparently under much even higher threat, but thus far seem to be hanging on. I think it's probably a salutary warning to people in Southeast Asia that really things aren't looking good there either. So it also looked at future impacts of climate change. Really, we tried to look at both the derived impacts of warming seas and the projections for bleaching and bleaching impacts. Here you can see we looked for both for the decade of the 2030s and the decade of the 2050s, and the map shows how alerts, basically as we go into yellows and oranges, the likelihood of over 50% of years are likely to have a bleaching event. So by the 2030s, you can see it's pretty widespread in the Western Pacific and in the Central Indian Ocean. But by the 2050s, it's ubiquitous. The threat of bleaching events being every other year is extremely likely. We also used the work of Caldera to look at the likelihood of acidification having an impact on coral reefs. And again, we've used their models, their projections for changing acidities, using the building towards a CO2 doubling in 2050. See from these, basically, as you go into yellows and towards brown colours, that we're moving into extremely marginal conditions for to be able to grow, to be able to lay down calcium carbonate skeletons and keep on growing. And as we built these, we built these two layers onto the global threat map that can't direct human impacts. We added on the risks that we estimated from these future impacts of combining bleaching and acidification. And by the 2030s, 90% of the world's reefs will be threatened by human activities. And by the 2050s, really talking about everywhere, over 99% of the world's reefs threatened. I want to briefly, before I go into the what on earth we do about all of this, to talk briefly about a couple of sidebar projects that fit within the Reefs at Risk report, and I think have been really interesting add-ons to the work that we did earlier, Reefs at Risk report. First is the work largely done by Alison Perry, one of our co-authors, which looked at the vulnerability of people to the degradation of reefs. And we tried to really work who and where people were more likely to be threatened. The approach we took was to use our own, the reef threats maps that I've just been talking you through, and to try and build some models at the national level of dependence on reefs and the ability to adapt to change. And you can see the sorts of layers we were using to try and estimate those two, dependence and adaptive capacity. A couple of images to take you through some of this. You can read more about it and also download the technical notes, which will tell you more about how we did it. One of the first things we did was we looked at how many people are what we called reef-associated. We hear lots of statistics bandied around by different groups, and it's often hard to know what's the best statistic to use. But we came up with a figure of 275 million people are living low altitude, pretty much at sea level, within 30 kilometers of a coral reef. And then we number 275 million reef-associated people. These are people likely to be benefit from or depending on coral reefs in some way or other. We looked at nutritional dependence on coral reefs, and here's quite an impressive list of the people who are consuming seafood The Maldives top all the charts, 180 kilos of fish per person per year being consumed in the Maldives. But look at this list of nations on the left-hand side, and they're all the small island states, the oceanic islands of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. These are people who really need coral reefs for their protein supply, for their health, food security. But we have other levels of dependence as well. So exports of reef-related products, which includes aquatic products, includes fish for food, and also some of the aquaculture taking place in reef lagoons. And there you've got somewhere like French Polynesia. 62% of its GDP is based around exports from reefs. Tourism. We've got data for 96 countries and territories. And tourism makes up more than 15% of GDP in 23 nations around the world. So it's pretty important. Coastal protection, and this is one that's often very hard to quantify, certainly in numerical or dollar terms. But coastal protection, we modelled more than 150,000 kilometres of shoreline are protected in close proximity to coral reefs. By combining reef dependence with the threats and the vulnerability, we come up with this map of the most highly reef-dependent countries and territories. Half of them are Pacific, but also another in the Caribbean, and really this incredible concentration on the island states who have reliance on the reefs and often have nowhere else to go, nowhere to turn. So if we combine this so it's reef dependence with the threat, and we pick the 27 most vulnerable countries and territories, you can see this map there. It's spread right across the tropics, but 19 of these 27 are these small island states. So the vulnerability is combining this dependence with this lack of alternative options. And I think this work is best summarized in this graphic here, which lists the countries that are dependent in the blue circle, high exposed to threats in the orange circle, have relatively low or medium adaptive capacity. In other words, there are few alternatives in terms of livelihoods and so on. And you can see the countries in there for yourselves. But again, small islands dominating the scene. And really, the story it tells is that we need to seriously think about the social and economic impacts of reef degradation, not just the biodiversity impact. And we need to try, for the sake of these coral reef peoples and nations, to try to reduce their dependence, to increase livelihood diversification, and enhance their capacity to adapt to change. Another side project of the work was to look at protected areas, and we produced a list of 2,600 marine protected areas, which cover 27% of the world's coral reefs. It's a strikingly high figure, 27%. So, in a sense, that's good news to some degree. They're ranking as one of the best protected habitats in the world, at least on paper. Within the work, we tried to then look at how effective those were, and we were looking at ecological effectiveness. Are they making a difference to the fish communities and the ecological communities within them? And we do an assessment of this effectiveness. Very rough cut type review, but we were able to capture most of the coral reefs within protected areas in our rapid review. We found that about 6% of the world's coral reefs lie within effective protected areas, but a 13% within partially effective protected areas. Those are hugely skewed by Australia. If you take out of the equation, the figure is 17% of the world's reefs fall within protected areas. Really, the low-scoring areas regions of the world, the Middle East, and the only of their reefs within protected areas. A large proportion of those ineffective. So really, I've been using words like knife edge, and the future does look very grim for the world's coral reefs. But we can't give in to gloom, and we need to start thinking, continue thinking, and sort of up the ante on how we're going to turn things around. How can we make things better for coral reefs? Photos on this slide, by the way, are all taken in Cuba, where you can see some pretty extensive staghorn reefs and quite a few sharks in some areas. The report has about 60 sort of generic recommendations within it, and I'm through some of these I'd really people to have a look, because I think it just gives a sense. There's no silver bullet. There's no quick, simple answer. We can't just rely on one approach, protected areas or whatever it might be, to solve this problem. We've got to try and hit this on multiple levels. As a sort of series of recommendations that we've got to try and reduce some of these direct impacts. There's quite good evidence that reefs are more robust and resilient if we can reduce the direct human pressures. So think about coastal development. Well, what have we got to do? We've got to protect some of the critical coastal habitats, mangroves, dunes and beach vegetation. We've got to encourage the establishment of coastal setback type relations that stop people building hard on the shore. How to develop, we've got to work how to do it sensibly so that there's not sort of knock-on effects up and down the coast as sediments are released from the building of marinas and so on. Waste management, critical that we start to control sewage release into coastal waters. And we've got to try to link marine protected areas with the terrestrial counterparts to try and get a more joined-up approach. Tourism, of course, is something that we can all work on, and we've got to make tourism become a force for good rather than a contributor to the problem. We've got to reduce the stuff coming off the watersheds, the land-based sources of threat, and that means better management of how land is used, controls of livestock waste and grazing, and so on. There's all sorts we can do to try and reduce some of the marine-based sources of threats. There are now ballast water regulations in many countries to reduce the release of invasive species. We've got to improve what gets let out in ports and marinas, and do a better job of managing where show from the very biggest ships down to yachts and dive boats and so on. And unsustainable fishing, that biggest direct threat of all, needs, again, at multiple levels. Fisheries do need to be better managed. We can use marine protected areas for some of that, but there are other tools in the toolkit to deal with that. We've got to try and stop for subsidies and try and reduce fishing capacity. And some of this takes us right down to the basics of trying to understand what the drivers of overfishing are: poverty, poor governance, insecurity, and so on. And again, many of the people on this call are going to be familiar with some of this, but we need to start managing coral reefs for climate change. It's a fact. It's advancing fast. And there's some evidence that we can manage reefs in a better state to either survive or to bounce back from coral bleaching events, and to be more robust in their growth even as acidification starts to kick in. That whole suite of measures hits at multiple sectors in society. It hits, we need to think about community levels, we need to think about senior or high levels of governments, we need to think between fisheries and environment and development sectors. And that joined up thinking is going to be tremendously important. But we need to think about scaling up our efforts. The pictures left here show how we've been working towards thinking about ocean zoning in St. Kitts and Nevis in the Caribbean. But even between countries, how people need to start thinking very large level to make a change, to make changes. And we need to think really globally, trying to hit at the climate change conventions and so on. We need to build consensus, and that means education, more research, bringing people in, and supporting the policymakers. And we finish up with a set of individual actions that really we encourage people to think about. Reducing impacts if you live near reefs. Whether fishermen or just someone who's nearby. Visitors. Obviously, visitors are driving some of the changes in coral reef coastlines, but by being free tourists, they can make a difference, a positive difference. And right down to all of us, wherever we are, reducing our carbon emissions. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know if this is going to do what I wanted to do. I don't know if it'll be as impressive, but Reefs at Risk was a huge, huge effort. You should be seeing, I hope, a list of names scrolling up. These are all the contributors to, literally hundreds of contributors to Reefs at Risk. Scientists really from around the world, and without them, this would have really not been anything like it is now. But also the group of organizations that have been involved with this. I think eventually when this slide finishes, there's going to be 25 logos appearing on here, from governments to NGOs to academic institutions. They have lent a heck of a lot of support, information, advice to this, and with that comes a lot of credibility. And so we're extremely grateful to all of them. I'm going to stop there. I've gone on probably long, but we started late, and I'm now questions.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's just a tremendous amount of work, and I know some of your co-authors are on the call, and you guys have really made an impressive product. And it's the leak. It's I think really a catalyst to get us moving. So with that, we do have a few minutes for questions, not too long. So again, if you have them, put them in the little chat or do the little hand raising. So we'll just start off with those who have chimed in already. So I think Steph has a question.
Yeah, am I on mute or hello?
You're on.
Okay, great. Hey, Mark. I have a couple questions for you. The first one is about any idea or plans to categorize or quantify the actual condition of reefs. So I know that what we're seeing here is the threat, the level of threat to these areas, and that obviously raises questions when you look at the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, and you noted that in your talk. But is there any plan to condition? And then also, I know you guys went deeper last time you did this 13 years ago regionally. Are you planning to do that as well this round?
Okay, first, I owe to say that we were really grateful to get a ton of data from the monitoring groups and agencies you can see on the screen now, some of them, Agri-Reef Check and so on. And we did use that information to, in a sense, ground truth and check some of our findings. But as you said, there's kind of slight disconnect between the level of threat a place may be under and actually what's happened to it in terms of changing condition. I think the group working together have not actually got plans right now to move on to try and build an actual observation of condition type database, but that stuff is being gathered all the time by the different organizations who are doing reef monitoring around the world. I think we can all do better, and the need to try and improve data sets and to make them compatible and comparable is strong. I don't think this group's going to be getting too involved with that. Yeah.
Do you think there's value in that, or do you think we have the information we need?
We mustn't wait for that slow us down. I mean,
okay.
I think that's my big thing is that it's so urgent now. We know enough. We've just got to get moving, but we've got to keep that information coming in too. And talk to this audience, because I know a lot of people listening are kind of locally based, if you like, reef managers at national or subnational scales. That's where you really need that kind of level of information, because you navigate with a Reefs at Risk map. It's a rude tool which gives you a sense of what's happening worldwide, but you know, and you need the monitoring to know exactly where things are going right and going wrong.
And the question was about going deeper regionally, I think.
Yeah, I know that Loretta is on the call actually, but she's keen to start reprinting some of this material at local scales, but not redoing the analyses at this stage. And we can do a lot with that already, because there's so much in this that can be unpacked further than we can in a global document. So I think the first stage will be that we produce some regional summaries and maybe go into a little more depth with those. I think it'll be some years before we try and do more detailed regional studies again.
Great, thanks. We have another question regarding deep sea corals, and the fact you mentioned they're very different from the sort of shallow reef building corals. But do you know offhand if they're under threat from the same as shallow water corals, and such as climate change, and is it estimated they'll be in vast decline similarly to the corals, to the shallow corals?
It's a great question. I don't know if I'm the right person to answer it. Clearly, some of the threats won't be there. Generally, those systems further offshore, so some of the land-based threats will be much reduced. Of course, they've been hammered by trawling, so destructive fishing approaches have really hit those. And it's pretty clear that acidification is going to be hitting those reefs just as much as it hits shallow water reefs. But I do think, this is a personal thing, that we should think of those as different habitats. I don't think it benefits us to try and confuse people by talking about the two systems as if they were one.
Okay. I'm going to combine these next two a little bit here because they're very similar. But so a lot of the recommendations you mentioned were for where the coral reefs are actually based. So what countries, a lot of these small island nations can do. Is there? Have you guys discussed? The authors discussed how you make sort of these non-reef, powerful, richer nations care more, especially given the economic situation in so many of those non-reef countries, which is also quite poor at the moment. Like, how do you get in the U.S. or other wealthier countries to start waving this Reefs at Risk book around in their Senate or Parliament or whatever it may be? Has that come up at all?
It is a challenge there, but I think a couple of quick thoughts. One is tourism. I mean, the wealthy nations are often the ones who are heading down to Florida, or in other words, they're home, but they're going to a different state, or out to the Caribbean islands and the ocean and so on. And those people do some affinity for reefs. Really interesting part of this story, and it's really, we're just starting down the line, but TNC is actually just about to release, or has released some video on this, is the role of coral reefs in medicine. We're already aware of some fantastic new medical products that have been derived from reef organisms, cancer, HIV, and others. I don't off the top of my head know what they are, but the reefs are tremendously important, and the pharmaceutical industry has only just started. It's a little bit challenging, obviously, to work in marine environments. They've just been working their way through the forests of the world, but what they're learning so far is immense value. So I think we can try and plug that one. That gets at the kind of even the cold-hearted don't care brigade. I think for the people who are already engaged and interested in the environment, I'm really keen that we encourage them to feel part of the coral reef world and get them involved, supporting NGOs and talking about these issues. And of course, everyone, as I said, we've got to think about how we can reduce climate change. And I think as individuals on that, obviously a tiny drop in the ocean, but it carries a message to the people we meet and to the people who govern us. And I think that's really important.
you. I think it's we're gonna end on that. If you have additional questions that we didn't get to, please drop me or Liz a note, and we will make sure they get answered for you. I want to thank Mark and all the contributors to this amazing product. Thanks so much. Again, we'll have this listed as a WRI page where you can link to the PDF of the report and a lot of the data. And stay tuned for announcements on our next webinar. And thanks again, everyone, for coming. And this will be recorded, and we will send that out also afterwards. So have a great day. Thanks again, Mark, and to everyone for staying on.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay.